Black Wall Street was one of the most prosperous black communities in the nation. In late May and early June of 1921, the thriving neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, faced violence that destroyed businesses, displaced families, and altered lives for generations. This is a story of entrepreneurs and neighbors, of survival and loss, and of how a single event was met with silence for decades. In the next few minutes, you will hear first-hand accounts, learn overlooked facts, and see how the aftermath shaped economic inequality and memory in America. Understanding this history matters because it helps explain present struggles and points to what justice and remembrance might require. If you find this important, consider subscribing for more thoughtful historical explorations. Hook, a prosperous neighborhood erased in a single night. In Tulsa's Greenwood neighborhood, a concentrated center of black entrepreneurship and civic life flourished, with locally owned banks, hotels, theaters, churches, and newspapers serving a thriving community. Entrepreneurs such as O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford helped build a neighborhood that supported professionals, shopkeepers, and skilled laborists. The Tulsa Star, edited by A.J. Smitherman, amplified local voices and civic concerns. Residents invested in land and businesses, and the area became widely known as a place of economic self-determination and cultural vitality. Tensions that had been mounting in the city erupted during a single night in May 31st to June 1st, 1921, when a violent assault by white mobs, supported in part by official forces, overwhelmed Greenwood. Many homes and businesses were burned or otherwise destroyed, and thousands of black residents were displaced. The immediate human toll included people who lost not just possessions but livelihoods, records, and the institutions that helped sustain community life. Men, women, and children found themselves forced into temporary camps or seeking shelter with relatives elsewhere in the city. Survivors' stories emphasize both loss and resilience. A barber who built his shop from savings watched his clientele scatter. A schoolteacher who had nurtured generations of students saw classrooms leveled and textbooks lost. Owners of small banks and hotels faced denied insurance claims and legal barriers when attempting to rebuild property. For decades, some families were unable to recover the capital and records needed to restore generational wealth, and many descendants still point to this disruption as a turning point in their family histories. The wider consequences reached into civic memory and public policy. For many years, the event was minimized in official accounts and omitted from school curricula. Later efforts toward truth and reconciliation gained traction, including a state commission appointed in 1997 that produced a detailed report in 2001 with findings and recommendations addressing the historical record and potential remedies. Research and memorial work continued into the next century, including new historical centers, commemorations, and investigations using modern techniques to better understand what happened and where victims were laid to rest. Today, the Greenwood district is a place of layered history. Museums and cultural centers, memorials, and community organizations work to preserve stories and to support education and economic renewal. The material losses of that night remain a powerful example of how violence against property and people can shape opportunities across generations. If this history matters to you, please consider subscribing for more calm, factual explorations of events that continue to shape our present. Why Tulsa remained hidden from history for decades. Greenwood was a self-sufficient enclave of black-owned wealth and enterprise, with banks, hotels, theaters, professional offices, and a thriving Main Street that earned it the nickname Black Wall Street. The neighborhood's prosperity was not accidental. It grew from disciplined entrepreneurship, community institutions, and a concentration of skilled tradespeople and professionals who served black clientele barred from many white establishments. Oral histories from survivors recall a lively commercial corridor, social clubs, churches, and a hospital that together created a resilient civic life. When violence swept through the district in 1921, its physical destruction and human toll were devastating. Official figures recorded a relatively small number of deaths, while survivors and later researchers estimated fatalities could be as high as 300. Homes and businesses were burned or looted and thousands of residents were left homeless. Because of the scale of loss, the immediate aftermath was chaotic, and many families dispersed, some never returning to rebuild what they had lost. Silence settled over the event for decades for many reasons. Fear and intimidation kept survivors from speaking openly. Social and legal pressures discouraged public inquiry. Mainstream local institutions often downplayed or omitted the incident. Newspapers at the time published racially charged reports that inflamed tensions, and subsequent civic narratives preferred to move on rather than confront the causes and consequences. Insurance claims by black property owners were routinely denied on grounds that the damage was the result of riot rather than other causes, which prevented compensation and erased a paper trail of ownership and claims. Urban planning choices compounded the erasure. Redevelopment projects and new infrastructure were sometimes placed on top of former Greenwood parcels, further obscuring the neighborhood's original footprint. Official acknowledgement lagged behind survivors' testimonies and community memory. For many years, school curricula and public histories either ignored the events or treated them as a marginal episode. Archival neglect and the loss of records made scholarly reconstruction difficult. It took decades of persistent work by researchers, descendants, and advocates to bring documentary evidence, oral testimony, and legal records into focus. A state-sponsored commission in 2001 helped codify many of these findings and directed attention to long-standing demands for recognition and redress. The long concealment shaped consequences that lasted generations. Economic recovery for Greenwood's families was blocked by lost property, denied insurance, and restricted access to lending and markets. Social wounds deepened as stories were buried within families rather than shared in public forums. In recent years, there has been renewed interest. Museums, memorials, academic studies, and educational initiatives have pushed the event back into public awareness and classroom discussion. Survivors' accounts and community archives have become central to that revival, supplying the human stories that official records once minimized. For more historical narratives like this, consider subscribing for gentle, careful exploration of overlooked events. Greenwood, the rise of Black Wall Street. During the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, a distinctive neighborhood took shape on the north side of Tulsa, founded and sustained by black landowners and entrepreneurs who purchased property and built a community of their own. Ottawa W. Gurley was one of the earliest and most active figures, acquiring land and selling lots to black families and business owners. His approach encouraged private ownership at a time when opportunities elsewhere were limited. The pattern of land sales and neighborhood development created concentrated pockets of black wealth and independence, anchored along a principal commercial corridor known as Greenwood Avenue. Local zoning and social segregation pushed many African American residents to create parallel institutions. So they did. A dense cluster of businesses rose along Greenwood: grocery stores, barbershops, tailor shops, beauty parlors, and restaurants that served both everyday needs and social life. Professional services were plentiful, too, with black doctors, dentists, lawyers, and pharmacists operating practices that served the community without the barriers found in white neighborhoods. One prominent business leader, J.B. Stratford, invested heavily in hospitality and real estate, building a large hotel that welcomed black travelers and functioned as a community landmark. The Tulsa Star, a black newspaper published in Greenwood, provided news, opinion, and a forum for civic organization, amplifying local voices and helping to knit the neighborhood together. The street was busy and confident. Life moved there. Mutual aid and community institutions underpinned economic growth. Churches and fraternal organizations offered financial support, networking opportunities, and social services. They pooled resources for new ventures and for relief in hard times. Local banks and credit arrangements, organized and managed by black entrepreneurs, kept capital circulating inside Greenwood rather than flowing outward to white-owned establishments. Women played central roles as business owners and organizers, running boarding houses, beauty shops, and community clubs that strengthened social bonds and sustained daily commerce. The result was not merely a strip of shops, but an ecosystem in which profits were reinvested and reputations were built. The cultural life reflected that economic success. Theaters and lodges hosted performances and meetings, while churches anchored education and civic activity. Young people could find apprenticeships and work, and professionals were respected neighbors rather than footnotes in someone else's economy. Greenwood became a model of black economic self-determination that drew attention from the region. Its story is one of enterprise and community resilience, and if you appreciate careful historical narration, consider subscribing for more calm, factual explorations. Segregation, tension, and the spark of accusation. Greenwood had grown into a remarkably self-sufficient African American community, with entrepreneurs, doctors, lawyers, churches, and theaters concentrated on a few blocks that came to be known as Black Wall Street. Business leaders such as O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford invested in land and commerce, creating a vibrant local economy even as state and local laws enforced segregation across public life. Jim Crow practices shaped daily existence. Public facilities were separate, housing and employment options were constrained, and the criminal justice system treated black citizens differently. Yet Greenwood's institutions, its schools, businesses, and social clubs, fostered a strong sense of pride and mutual aid. Tensions simmered beneath that pride. Many white Tulsans chafed at Greenwood's prosperity, and racial stereotypes and resentment made the community a frequent target of rumor and hostility. Returning black veterans who had served their country expected respect and were less willing to accept second-class treatment. Short exchanges in public space could escalate quickly because the broader social order allowed unequal treatment by police, courts, and the press. Local newspapers sometimes published inflammatory accounts that magnified small incidents into perceived threats, and those reports traveled fast through the city. The immediate catalyst was a tense encounter in an elevator between a young black man, Dick Rowland, and a white elevator operator, Sarah Page. A complaint was made, and Rowland was arrested and charged with an alleged assault. The accusation itself never resulted in a conviction. The charge was later dropped. Still, the arrest touched a raw nerve. A provocative newspaper article and local editorials helped to stir a large white crowd, while members of the black community, fearing a lynching, gathered at the courthouse in hopes of protecting Rowland and ensuring due process. Authorities attempted to keep the peace, but the situation was fragile and poorly managed. What followed from that spark reflected long-standing structural injustice as much as a single incident. Immediate reactions included the mobilization of armed groups, mass arrests, and widespread displacement of residents. Families who had built lives and businesses in Greenwood found themselves suddenly vulnerable. Survivors carried trauma forward, and for decades many stories went untold or were minimized in public records. Efforts to document, investigate, and seek redress emerged slowly over time as descendants and scholars pressed for recognition of what happened and for measures to repair harms. If this account resonates, please subscribe for more measured historical narratives. The courthouse standoff and growing mobs. After the arrest of Dick Rowland on an allegation made by Sarah Page, crowds converged on the county courthouse with fears and determination on both sides. The initial gathering included neighbors and friends who wanted to ensure he would receive due process, and others who sought extrajudicial punishment. Tension mounted quickly as word spread through the community and through competing newspaper accounts, which captured attention across the city and intensified already raw emotions. Many black residents, including veterans who had returned from service and men who saw themselves as protectors of their neighborhood, arrived at the courthouse carrying firearms for what they described as defense of the accused and the community. A much larger white crowd also assembled, and local law enforcement began to enlist volunteers to bolster security. Deputization of armed white civilians, reported by several contemporary observers, altered the balance of authority in a way that heightened anxiety and suspicion on both sides. On the courthouse steps the situation crystallized into a tense, visible standoff. Eyewitness reports differ about who fired the first shot, and historians continue to note that uncertainty. What is clear is that the exchange of gunfire at that locus transformed a volatile demonstration into an armed confrontation, and that the spectacle of men standing with weapons on public steps became the spark that propelled the conflict outward. Families watched from windows and doorways, merchants closed shutters, and those who had gathered to protect someone they believed unfairly accused found themselves at the center of an escalating crisis. The standoff's immediate effect was to dissolve any remaining hope for a peaceful resolution at the courthouse. It shifted a legal incident into an outbreak of communal violence and set in motion events that would consume the neighboring district. Community leaders, survivors, and later historians have all pointed to that confrontation on the steps as the turning point when rumor and fear gave way to armed engagement. For more considered historical narratives like this one, please subscribe for calm, fact-based accounts. The night of destruction begins. A tense confrontation at the courthouse after an elevator incident set a combustible scene that night, and within hours the conflict moved into Greenwood, the thriving black neighborhood often called Black Wall Street. A young black man accused of an altercation with a white woman had already been arrested, and crowds gathered on both sides. Veterans from the black community came to the courthouse to offer protection, while white mobs assembled to demand extractions. Shots were fired in the chaos outside the county building, and the situation rapidly escalated into organized attacks against homes and businesses in Greenwood. As darkness fell, mobs, some reportedly deputized by local officials, began systematically targeting the district's commercial corridor and residences. Eyewitness accounts and later official investigations documented that private aircraft circled above and that incendiaries were used in some attacks. Many buildings were set alight and whole blocks were rendered unusable. Firefighting efforts were hampered by the scale of the assault and by orders that limited aid to the black community. Martial law was declared and state troops were eventually brought in, but not before extensive damage had been done. Individual stories capture the human stakes. Prominent black entrepreneurs who had built a self-sufficient economy lost life work and property. Among them were business owners who had established hotels, grocery stores, and a bank that supported local prosperity. A notable physician, a community leader, and other respected figures were killed or disappeared amid the violence. Survivors like Viola Fletcher would later recount the fear of families forced from their homes, the scramble to find shelter, and the months and years spent piecing together what remained. Many black residents were rounded up and held in makeshift detention sites, with their possessions left unattended or seized. The immediate aftermath of that night reshaped Greenwood for generations. Hundreds of homes and businesses were destroyed, and roughly 9,000 people were displaced and left without shelter or livelihoods. Official counts listed 36 deaths, but later inquiries concluded that the true toll was likely higher. The full human cost remained obscured by lost records and decades of silence. Insurance claims were often denied under riot exclusions, extinguishing the capital that had powered Greenwood's success. The economic and emotional consequences endured. Networks of wealth were fires, arrests, and the collapse of Greenwood. In 1921, blazes swept through Greenwood, consuming homes, churches, shops, and the livelihoods of families who had built a thriving neighborhood. Eyewitnesses describe how fire spread quickly through tightly packed wooden buildings, and some recalled private aircraft being used to fire on the ground and to drop incendiary devices, a detail corroborated by survivor testimony and later investigations. More than 35 blocks were affected, and the immediate material loss was staggering, with property damage estimated at more than $1,500,000 at the time. Streets that had been lined with prosperous black-owned businesses were reduced to charred storefronts and smoldering lots, and ash lay where record books, inventories, and personal mementos once were. Law enforcement and the military presence shaped the aftermath as decisively as the flames had shaped the landscape. The National Guard and local police established curfews and checkpoints, and approximately 1,000 black residents were detained and held in makeshift internment centers such as convention halls and fairgrounds. People were often seized from the streets or rounded up while seeking safety. They were held without formal charges and with limited access to counsel or the chance to reclaim property. By contrast, few white participants were arrested or prosecuted, and the lack of legal accountability compounded the sense of injustice among survivors and their descendants. The collapse of Greenwood was not only physical but also economic and social. Prominent black entrepreneurs, property owners, doctors, lawyers, and hotel keepers saw businesses wiped out and records destroyed. Men and women who had accumulated wealth through decades of hard work found themselves suddenly without the legal proof of ownership or the capital to rebuild. Insurance claims were frequently denied under riot clauses, and banks were reluctant to extend credit to displaced residents. About 8,000 people were left homeless and had to depend on charitable relief and family networks for shelter and food. Churches and community centers became emergency refuges, and stories of neighbors sheltering one another circulated for years as testimony to both loss and resilience. Long-term consequences unfolded across generations. The loss of property and disruption of business networks translated into a significant transfer of wealth away from Greenwood and into the broader economy, and families who might have passed on homes or businesses instead faced displacement and financial precarity. Silence and official minimization kept the event out of many public narratives for decades, delaying recognition, investigation, and redress. Still, survivors and their families rebuilt what they could, and the community's spirit endured even as its economic base never fully recovered. Subsequent inquiries and memorial efforts have sought to document the arrests, the fires, and the collapse of Greenwood with greater clarity and to acknowledge the human cost. If careful, factual explorations of history matter to you, consider subscribing for more calm, evidence-based narratives. Aftermath, mass displacement and silence. In the immediate wake of the violence, Greenwood's residents were left without the basic security of home and livelihood. Many who had built businesses and lived for generations in that neighborhood found themselves lawfully and unlawfully pushed out, relocated to congregate in churches, schoolrooms, and makeshift shelters. The convention hall and the fairgrounds became temporary holding sites for those seeking safety, and others slept in whatever public spaces would accept them. Relief agencies arrived, but assistance was uneven and often filtered through city control. Property loss translated quickly into long-term displacement. Black-owned banks, clinics, and theaters that once anchored the district were gone or severely damaged, and insurance companies frequently denied claims by citing exclusion clauses. Deeds and records were difficult to recover for years afterward, erasing clear chains of ownership and making restitution or rebuilding far more complicated. Business owners who had accumulated wealth over decades watched capital evaporate, and many families who had planned to pass property to the next generation no longer had anything to transfer. Silence settled over the event as powerfully as ashes once did. Voices were muffled by fear, shame, and pressure from local authorities. Schools did not teach what had happened, and municipal narratives downplayed the scale and responsibility of the destruction. Families often instructed children to say nothing about the night, and survivors frequently refused to recount their experiences in public for decades. This withholding compounded personal trauma, because wounds that are not acknowledged are harder to heal. The consequences echoed across generations. Displaced residents dispersed to other neighborhoods and cities, and the loss of businesses and homes contributed to a widening gap in generational wealth. Efforts to seek accountability and restitution took many forms, including legal challenges and civic investigations, but many claims met legal hurdles. Over time, scholars, community leaders, and descendants worked to recover documents and oral histories, and the community began to build memorials and educational centers to preserve memory and push for recognition. If this narration was helpful, consider subscribing for more calm, factual explorations of history. Cover-up, denial, and lost justice. In 1921, the scale of violence and loss was matched by an equally determined effort to obscure what had happened, and that choice shaped generations. Local authorities and newspapers framed the narrative almost immediately, directing attention away from organized attacks and toward isolated incidents, and many official records were limited or never produced. Survivors were detained and questioned while white rioters faced little legal consequence. Property deeds and insurance claims were delayed, denied, or left unresolved. A pattern of selective documentation and institutional silence followed the community for decades. The denial took practical forms. Insurance companies rejected claims on riot exclusions. Courtrooms closed the door to many late challenges. Evidence that might have supported prosecutions or civil claims was lost, destroyed, or never collected. For families trying to prove ownership, the absence of complete municipal records turned a fight for restitution into a labyrinth. Some personal papers and photographs survived, but official archives offered frustrating gaps. Community memory preserved many of the human stories that official channels did not. Oral histories kept the names of business owners and families alive. Neighbors who rebuilt in the months after the violence recalled being held in pens and ordered to hand over jewelry and cash. Children grew up hearing about vanished homes and shuttered stores. Those accounts, painstakingly collected by scholars and local historians, provided crucial counter-evidence to the public silence that followed. Efforts to secure justice met legal and political barriers. Lawsuits filed by survivors and descendants were often dismissed on procedural grounds, leaving substantive questions unanswered. A later state study acknowledged failures of investigation and the inadequacy of the official response, and it recommended measures to address the harms. Ground-penetrating radar and archival searches in more recent years have raised new questions about unrecorded burials and missing documentation, yet they have also highlighted how much time and neglect had already obscured. The long absence of accountability has had lasting consequences. Generational wealth that might have been preserved or rebuilt was instead eroded. Civic trust was fractured. Yet the persistence of survivors, descendants, historians, and community activists slowly changed the public record. Museums, memorials, and scholarship now make room for those lost stories. If you would like more detailed histories like this, please consider subscribing. Legacy, remembrance, and why the story matters today. The destruction of Greenwood shattered tangible wealth and intangible trust. The neighborhood had been a concentrated center of black entrepreneurship, with hotels, theaters, banks, and dozens of small businesses serving a prosperous community. Official counts recorded roughly 36 deaths in the aftermath, though many historians and researchers consider that number an undercount and estimate losses could be as high as 300. Entire blocks of homes and businesses were burned or looted, and insurance claims were frequently denied on the basis that the damage resulted from civil unrest. Property deeds, business ledgers, and personal papers were lost or scattered, erasing much of the documentary record that later generations would need to prove ownership and to seek restitution. Survivors' accounts emphasize displacement, legal exclusion, and the long process of rebuilding. Families who once owned property in the district returned to find ash and rubble, and many were forced to sell what remained or could not reclaim land taken through inflated taxes or legal pressures. Children who grew up in Greenwood carried the memory into adulthood. Some became teachers and community leaders determined to preserve what remained, while others left to seek opportunities elsewhere. Oral histories collected by scholars and community groups convey the rhythms of daily life before the attack and the quiet resilience of those who tried to restore schools, churches, and businesses afterward. Public memory was suppressed for decades, and the omission from many schoolbooks compounded the silence surrounding the event. In recent times, efforts have multiplied to document and commemorate the community. Museums and memorials offer exhibits, artifacts, and educational programs. Public parks and plaques mark sites of significance, and local and national commissions have compiled reports and recommendations aimed at truth-telling and redress. A state-appointed commission produced a comprehensive investigation that recommended measures including memorials, scholarships, and health supports, even as legislative and legal responses have been partial. Popular culture and scholarship have also widened public awareness, prompting city-led initiatives to preserve records and to fund community-led redevelopment. What endures is not only the record of loss but the lesson for civic life. Honest acknowledgement of past injustices matters for present policy and collective healing. The Greenwood story is cited in contemporary conversations about economic inequality, property restitution, and the role of memory in education. It is also a reminder that civic institutions must protect all citizens' rights to life, liberty, and property. When communities invest in memorialization, archive survivors' testimonies, and incorporate these histories into classrooms, they lay groundwork for a more informed public discourse. If you found this account useful, consider subscribing for thoughtful, calm histories told with care. As we close this account of the Tulsa Race Massacre, let us hold to the facts, the faces, and the long shadow that day cast across generations. Greenwood, celebrated as Black Wall Street for its thriving businesses, churches, and schools, was attacked in 1921 amid racial tensions, misinformation, and failures of protection. Homes, businesses, and lives were taken. Families were displaced, records and archives were lost, and a community's prosperity was interrupted. For decades that trauma was minimized and often omitted from public history, leaving survivors and descendants to carry both grief and resilience. Remembering this event means honoring the people who built Greenwood, the courage of those who survived, and the relatives who fought for acknowledgement. It also means recognizing the consequences, legal and economic injustice, long-delayed investigations and memorials, and ongoing conversations about repair, remembrance, and civic responsibility. If this history matters to you, take a moment to reflect and to learn more. Share this story with someone who should know it, explore survivor testimonies and primary documents, and support efforts to preserve memorials and education so future generations are not left in the dark. If you found this meaningful, please consider subscribing for more carefully researched histories. In upcoming episodes, we will look closer at Greenwood's rebuilding, the testimonies of survivors and their families, and the efforts underway toward recognition and restorative justice. Thank you for watching, and for keeping these stories alive.